What if I told you that Ferrari discovered something in Hamilton's car that they didn't even know was possible? What if that discovery made Vasseur angry, but also redefined Ferrari's future in the middle of the 2025 season? What was found in Austin was not a trap, it was pure driving magic. The 2025 United States Grand Prix was already in the books. For many, it had been just another race on the calendar with its moments of tension, its risky strategies, and with the spotlight pointing to the fight between McLaren, Mercedes, and Red Bull. However, what happened in the Ferrari garages the next day was much more important than any overtaking on the track. It was the moment the team discovered there was something hidden in Hamilton's car. Not an illegal piece, not a regulation error, but something much more powerful, a truth hidden in the data that no engineer had anticipated. It all started with a routine review after sprint qualifying. The Maranello engineers were not looking for anything in particular. It was a standard checkup. But as happens with great finds, the discovery came not from what they were looking for, but from what they didn't know they had to look for. Telemetry data from the SF25 driven by Hamilton began to show unusual signs. Car behavior that simply did not fit the theoretical models. And in Formula One, that is an alarm. The first sign was subtle: stability in fast corners where the car, by design, should be more nervous. Then, significantly lower tire degradation than expected, up to 30% less wear on the plank, the wooden board under the car that regulates contact with the ground. Lastly, the downforce flow was inconsistent with the car's geometry. The inevitable question was, what is Hamilton doing inside the car that is not on the plans? The answer baffled the team. They checked onboard cameras. They compared lines. They analyzed braking and turning points. And then they understood it. Hamilton had created an invisible solution, one with no mechanical modification, no aerodynamic improvements, no software. It was pure instinct, pure talent, pure experience distilled lap after lap. He had adapted his driving with almost surgical precision, accelerating just before at key points, braking with variable pressure, releasing the steering wheel in load transfer phases, all to compensate for structural defects of the SF25. It was as if the car had two versions: the SF25 from the simulators, slow and unstable, and Hamilton's SF25, unpredictable but effective. A car that didn't exist until he made it exist. This difference was not a small margin. It was redefining the operational behavior of the car in the race. And that discovery, more than any victory, was the moment that changed Ferrari's internal paradigm. The car had not been corrected from the factory. It had been reinterpreted from the cockpit. This revelation was more than a technical shock. It was an emotional blow for the engineers, who went from skepticism to astonishment. They weren't dealing with a simple pilot who needed adaptation. They were looking at someone who could take an imperfect car and make it competitive with his bare hands. It was as if Hamilton had become an engineer in the middle of the straight, programming the car's behavior curve after curve using nothing more than his instinct and experience. For Vasseur, this was a mix of emotions. First, concern. Why did the car perform differently with only one driver? Then frustration. Why hadn't their systems caught this before? But finally, admiration. Because what they had discovered was not a trap or a flaw. It was an opportunity. An opportunity to understand the SF25 from a new perspective. Not the one dictated by wind tunnels or supercomputers, but the one written with Hamilton's right foot and his touch on the steering wheel. And so, overnight, Ferrari stopped seeing Hamilton as the newcomer who still had to adapt. They began to see him as a technical asset, a living source of data, a man capable of detecting with his body what sensors cannot. The car had not been redesigned, but it had been reimagined. And it had all started with a strange piece of information on a telemetry sheet. The beginning of a silent revolution within the most legendary team in F1. To understand the scope of what Ferrari had discovered in Hamilton's car, you must first understand the paradigm that governs the modern development of a Formula One. Every corner, every aerodynamic vortex, every interaction between brake and suspension is modeled by high-fidelity simulations. Data is everything. And pilots, in theory, they should stick to that data. Don't deviate. Don't improvise. But that was precisely what Lewis Hamilton broke. He not only exceeded the limits of the car, he redefined the role of the driver within Ferrari's technical ecosystem. The conflict broke out the moment the engineers understood the magnitude of the adjustment that Hamilton was making from the cockpit. It wasn't just good driving. It was an active recalibration of the SF25's behavior on the fly. Lewis was dynamically modifying the way the car behaved under braking, weight transfer, and even interacting with the DRS, all without a single external intervention. No upgrades needed, no new parts ordered. He just drove it, like no one else could. This phenomenon raised internal doubts that quickly became points of friction. Because what Hamilton did with his car, Leclerc couldn't replicate it. Not because of a lack of talent, but because the level of adaptability that the Brit showed seemed to operate in another dimension. Leclerc trusted the logic of the engineers, the development process, the consistency of the machine. Hamilton, on the other hand, trusted what he felt in his body. And that is something that no sensor can quantify. Vasseur at first reacted with discomfort. These types of findings generate political noise in any F1 team. What does this mean for the consistency of car development? What if the car is only fast when one of the drivers drives it? Is Hamilton's custom car being built now? What role remains for Leclerc? Questions like this began to bounce around within the Maranello paddock. Because the conflict was not only technical, it was philosophical. The breaking point came in a post-race technical meeting where the data of both drivers was compared. The differences were brutal. And not because one was making mistakes, but because one was operating outside the frame of reference. Hamilton was taking advantage from the intangible, how he modulated the brake in medium-speed corners, how he compensated for lateral load losses with subtle variations in torque on the rear axle, how he exploited the unstable balance of the car to his advantage in phases of progressive acceleration. It was almost unnatural. This realization forced Ferrari's engineers to admit an uncomfortable reality. They were faced with a driver who had understood the car on a deeper level than themselves. Not only that, he had found a way to make it competitive without asking for anything in return. Without whining about understeer, without demanding changes to the rear wing, without demanding new engine maps. Only with his hands, feet and head. And that, inevitably, had consequences. The car's development line had to be re-evaluated. The base configuration of the SF25 was adapted from Hamilton telemetry. What was previously considered a danger zone in the car's behavior was now a point of optimization. The simulation parameters were updated to include what was previously considered an extreme driving style, but which with Hamilton had become standard. Ferrari stopped looking for solutions outside and began to study more closely what its own driver had revealed on the track. Ferrari could no longer look the other way. The driver they had signed to return them to the top had not only fulfilled his role on the track, but had also modified the internal rules of how a car should be understood and developed in Maranello. Lewis Hamilton, with a handful of weekends and 2 crucial technical sessions, had forced the team to see their own car in a new light. And the real revolution was just beginning. The first measure the team took was as quiet as it was radical, converting Hamilton's driving data into a reference. They were no longer just statistics on a screen. Now these were strategic assets. Every quick turn, every late brake, every micro-adjustment in the steering became an operating model. And we're not talking about simple data curves. We are talking about a completely new language to interpret the physical limitations of the SF25. Engineers began programming new parameters into the team's simulators. The expected downforce ranges were adjusted, the thermal limits of the brakes in high-demand conditions were redefined, and the ERS energy management maps were reconfigured. But the most important thing was not technical. It was mental. Ferrari had understood that they could not continue building a car so that it behaved like the perfect machine. They had to build one that could speak the same language as Hamilton. Meanwhile, the first fruits of this transformation were already beginning to appear on the track. In subsequent sessions, Ferrari reported a significant improvement in lap consistency on long runs, a reduction in thermal stress on the brake system, and a stabilization of the rear airflow that allowed the load to be slightly increased without losing efficiency on the straight. The source of these adjustments? All traces of Hamilton. Ferrari, thanks to that discovery at the Austin GP, has begun a profound mutation. It's no longer about having the fastest car. It's about having the smartest car. And that intelligence today comes from the man who pilots it. Do you think this is the beginning of a new era for Ferrari? Are we facing the definitive resurrection of the prancing horse at the hands of one of the best drivers of all time? Or will this be just a fleeting flash in the middle of a project that continues to search for its identity? Leave me your opinion in the comments.